Role-playing games. It's a genre that is synonymous with the idea of player choice. Often, after a few hours of introduction to characters in the world in which you'll be playing, you're given free reign over where to go and who to talk to. And yeah, sure, I guess that does constitute some freedom. However, on a more granular level, these games to me are just as restrictive as their more linear counterparts. The dilemma with open world games giving players a greater variety of choice in how to spend their time and effort is that those choices players make need to have sufficient justification for their existence. If a game falls short of accomplishing this, it can leave me feeling disconnected from my character's actions. Unfortunately, this is often how I am left feeling when I play an RPG. I recently played the Outer Worlds, and after completing it, I can say with total honesty that I did enjoy it a lot. However, by the time the credits rolled, I felt like I experienced the game as more of a bystander than an active participant. Not to say I didn't take an active role in shooting bandits, selecting dialogue options, or making decisions. However, much of what I experienced in the game seemed to be entirely under the heel of the rules by which I was forced to play. That pretty much describes every game ever, so what do I mean by this? Well, to explore this thought, let's take a look at how the Outer Worlds and games like it handle progression. The way progression works in the Outer Worlds is identical to a litany of other titles. Accomplishing in-game events rewards you with experience points, or XP. Acquire enough experience and your character levels up, which then grants you skill and attribute points that can be spent upgrading and unlocking new abilities. We've seen it a million times. It's so ubiquitous because it works. This type of system offers an engaging enough gameplay loop that players, generally speaking, respond well to it. However, because there are so many specific skills to account for at any given time in the Outer Worlds, the way in which I was able to utilize them never felt meaningful. I think a reason for this is that the greater amount of character customization that is offered inevitably adds to the amount of considerations developers then have to implement into their game. So if there's a skill that lets players hack into computers or lockpick safes, then the game should have ample amounts of computers and safes to break into. Or if there are skills that enhance the status effects of consumable items, then there should be a sizable catalog of consumables with a variety of effects. In other words, the game needs to legitimize the player's choice in what skills they upgrade by giving them opportunities to use those skills. Unfortunately, the Outer Worlds idea of legitimizing a player's choice usually boiled down to a simple button press. I just had to click a button and then I was done. I experienced this most frequently in dialogue sequences. In the game, you can gather information about quests and individuals by talking to people. To encourage players to explore and experience the fantastic writing that the game has to offer, players can upgrade dialogue skills such as lie, persuasion, and intimidation. If one of these particular skills is a high enough level, then you'll be given access to dialogue options that would otherwise be blocked off if that skill was a lower level. In my playthrough, I quickly found myself leaning towards making sure my dialogue skills were at a high enough level that should one of those special options appear, I could choose to use it. I did this because I felt the most interesting parts of the game were to be found in the dialogue sequences rather than in stealth or outright combat. While I maintain that my favorite part of this game was the freedom I was allowed in choosing how to act when speaking to characters, this is also where it began to feel like it strayed away from being an actual game. I felt that way because all my dialogue skills, while they for the most part benefited me, became redundant in their execution. For instance, choosing to persuade or lie to someone could have consequences to my playthrough, like closing off a specific narrative branch. But I rarely felt that these were such a deterrent that I shouldn't do them if I wanted to. Just about every time I was given a special dialogue option and my corresponding skill was high enough, I chose to use it. More importantly though, the people I spoke to, without fail, believed my lies or fell victim to my persuasion. So really, all I had to do was make sure those skills were high enough and then the game would do the rest. There wasn't a risk of failure. I was never afraid that I'd be called out for a lie or they would shoot down my advances to extract more information from them. I was intrigued at the possibilities my dialogue choices could provide, however, I was seriously bored by how my role in them actually manifested. Now, if a game wants to offer an experience that attempts to emulate the minutiae found in real-world personalities, temperaments, and aptitudes, then here's what I think it should look like. Progression should be more directly related to my in-game actions, whether that just be from the natural flow of the game, optional activities, or mini-games, which would effectively be practicing grounds wherein I can hone my skills. Take a basic poker simulation, or whatever the Outer Worlds equivalent would be. Here, you could bluff your way to winning a hand that you had no business winning in the first place, thus increasing your character's effectiveness at line. But not just by some arbitrary number that could constantly be checked in the menus, but rather your character could begin to carry themselves with greater confidence in highly scrutinized situations. Then when speaking to a character, instead of just clicking on one option that has no chance of failure, you're given a few options that let you choose how to lie. Depending on who you're talking to could also affect the outcome. They might be especially perceptive, thus making it more difficult to choose the correct words that would eventually convince them. I understand that from my position outside of the game dev world, it's easy for me to make these sorts of suggestions. I don't have to figure out how to code and integrate such a system while also weaving God only knows how many more lines of dialogue into a much larger tapestry that is a full game. So practicality very might well trump ambition, and with all the broken games that are thrown at us nowadays, it's hard to blame devs when they choose the former and not the latter. That being said, more engaging dialogue sequences already exist. One example that my friend brought to my attention while I was writing the script for this video is Deus Ex Human Revolution, where talking to people becomes a game in and of itself. During conversations, the player must rely on important background information and the current behavior of whom they're speaking to in order to receive the desired outcome. Whereas in the Outer Worlds, steering the conversation in the direction you want it to go is detrimentally transparent. There's really no thinking required beyond, is this going to benefit me? Even in more dynamic situations like gunfights, where my abilities required me to actively think about their utility to the threat at hand, the effectiveness of those abilities relied on the static method in which they're upgraded in the game. For instance, in combat, you can slow down time to line up the perfect shot, which is a common ability found in lots of other games. Most games even let you increase the duration of this time dilating effect through an upgrade system like the one found in the Outer Worlds. But these systems only require you to spend points on that ability to improve it, rather than improving it over time the more you use it. Furthermore, those points that you spend on that ability could have been acquired doing completely unrelated actions, as there's no distinction between how you level up your character and what your points can be spent on. Instead of reaching numerical checkpoints that determine how long you can slow down time for, I should be rewarded for how effectively I use the ability. Say I begin slowing down time. Maybe the more shots I hit within the first few moments of using the ability eventually grants me increased movement or aiming speed while everyone else remains affected. Or simply the more accurate I am when time is slowed, the less my weapon sways. These suggestions and their underlying vision are already present in many games. Skyrim lets you level up individual skills the more you use them, like smithing. The more time you spend crafting weapons, the more adept your character gets at making better weapons. Red Dead Redemption 2 lets you grow the relationship you have with your horse the more you pet and feed it. This increases its stamina and the distance at which it will return to you when you call for it. And while I think these are definitely steps above how the Outer Worlds and other games handle progression, they still run into the same problematic territory for me. To me, they're saying practice makes perfect, which isn't a very accurate phrase, because I could go shoot a basketball like Michael Scott, but I'm not going to get any better at basketball. I could craft weapons all day long, but if all I have to do is have the materials and click a button, rather than actually applying game knowledge or legitimate skill to that process, I kinda just made a thing. Maybe it's a cool thing, but that's only because the game's code checked the underlying requirements and deemed my resources and skill to be acceptable. That's not to say every game takes such a basic approach. In another Rockstar game, Grand Theft Auto V, each of the 3 playable characters has a unique special ability that can be upgraded the more you do specific actions. Michael has a time dilation effect similar to the one in the Outer Worlds, where you can give yourself an edge in gunfights by slowing down time. As you get more headshots while using this ability, eventually you can use it for longer durations. The best example of this type of system that I can speak of from first-hand experience is Dying Light, where parkour is an integral part of survival. To escape the zombie hordes, you'll need to constantly string together daring maneuvers across the favela rooftops. At first, your character has a limited moveset, which keeps you from exploring the world for long periods of time due to the fact that once the sun goes down, the zombies are much more aggressive. But as you continue to practice, not only are you familiarizing yourself with the physics and mechanics of the game, you actually get experience points for successfully timing and pulling off a sequence of moves. What is especially unique about this is that those points can then be used in a skill tree that is specific to upgrading your parkour abilities. So now you're more confident in exploring the world for longer periods of time, which only means more practice with your parkour, which only means more skills can be unlocked. This is the type of system I would love to see implemented in more games, because this system rewards me for my execution rather than just the mere attempt. Regrettably though, progression in games has remained largely stagnant for some time now, where developers have the opportunity to incorporate so much of the worlds they create into their progression systems, they instead rely on what has become the status quo. As a result, these games can stray away from feeling like games to me. I'm not competing against anything other than what feels like the developer's idea of balance. That balance ensures there are plenty of rules I have to abide by, which, to be fair, is a prerequisite for any kind of game, video or otherwise, but they are so restrictive that even RPGs or games described as open world can wind up making me feel like another cog in the machine rather than its operator. Which is kind of ironic, because most games' storylines center around you and your character's importance to the world. The very things that are meant to provide choice to players can make large portions of games feel half-baked. The way I see it, games that suffer from this problem either spread themselves so thin that developers are unable to tend to their games more thoroughly, or they intentionally kept things simple so as not to alienate potential players and attract the largest possible audience. Either way, the result is the same for me. I believe this is an issue across most games with progression elements. However, I realize that not all games are suited for robust and intertwined progression systems. Many can get by with just the basics, and I certainly enjoy those games. That being said, when a major draw of RPGs is the freedom of choice it grants players, then that shouldn't solely hinge on a constrictive system of numerical checks and balances. As it stands though, our experiences in games are beholden to the depth of developers' imaginations, and save for a few outliers, this is universally the case. But that shouldn't be the impression a player is left with after spending time in such a narratively rich world as the one to be explored in the Outer Worlds. But that is the exact impression I was left with, that much of what my character became and did in the Outer Worlds was arbitrary, at the mercy of predetermined numbers. Numbers that masquerade themselves as player choice, but are really just there so the game can tell us what we can and cannot do.